Now it is day 2 of the Democratic Alliance's policy conference. Now while the event is closed to the media, discussion documents have been made public. Most notable from the conference is the party's adoption of resolutions in its economic justice policy and the party's views on race, quotas and triple BEE. Now to help us unpack the conference, I'm joined by Ivor Sarakinsky, a professor at the Wits School of Governance. Good to have you with us this afternoon, Prof. Perhaps let's start with definitions. They've adopted a stance of non-racialism versus multiracialism. In its practical application, how does that look like?
Well, that's the challenge that we're waiting to see how they respond to in their policy documents in terms of the economy and other interventions, to see whether they can square the circle of not focusing on race, but ensuring that you address the legacies of the past, which they declare in their principles document, which has since been made public. So they acknowledge the past, they deny race is a major factor in redressing the past, and now the burden of proof is on them to see whether they can come up with a feasible and workable alternative way of addressing the socio-economic and political challenges of South Africa.
Now, as you've mentioned, the DA is adopting a principle of non-racialism in its redress position, and it's focusing rather on reconciliation to tackle redress. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, reconciliation is obviously an important variable in that you need all South Africans to recognize their privilege, their disadvantage, and in that way find ways to take the society and the country forward. So that's pretty straightforward, and of course it's easy to say that. The really difficult one is how you do that when you want to focus on non-racialism. Because if you treat everyone equally, where people don't come to the table in a sense with the same historical legacies and advantages, then you, in a sense, reinforcing inequality. So the burden of proof really is on them to show how they can address the past in a way where you don't focus on race. And I'm waiting to see the documents on that one.
I'm reading here, and on Saturday, the delegates at the conference adopted non-racialism as one of the party's values and principles. And it says here, with no amendments made to the policy proposal put forward by the party's policy unit headed by Ngubeni. So how likely is it that something as controversial as this would actually be passed with absolutely no amendments from the other members? What do you make of this, Prof?
Well, we still have to read the document package as a whole. So with that proviso, my sense at the moment is that the principal documents, the principles on freedom of speech, on the economy, those kinds of issues are pretty straightforward, and they're avoiding controversy in some ways in making those simple statements in those Bauhaus color block releases that they've done. The really tricky stuff is where you've got to action that into a feasible program, and that's where I think the big fight will be in terms of the mechanics of how policy is going to work. Even at the level of those principles, you can see where the power in the DA is lying in terms of issues around state intervention, the economy, a pretty narrow understanding of state intervention based on market failures, a rather clumsy statement about state domination, which doesn't seem to make much sense, and one or two other issues that reveal a very strong economic liberalism dominating the content of those principles.
Now, quotas and BEE are tools that are used to tackle inequality, and the DA seems to imply that you can actually reverse issues of inequality and race in order to correct inequality. I mean, this seems a bit counterproductive and disingenuous, and one wonders how this will resonate with the party's constituency, especially its black constituency and its non-white constituency.
Absolutely. So I think the one principle that they've agreed on in terms of the legacies of discrimination, I think that's a campaigning principle where they can go out and say that we accept the legacy of the past and we will address it. The trick is how they're going to address it. And if you don't have quotas and if you don't have racial redress in your policy, it means you've got to do it in a different way. You've got to start to look at socioeconomic indicators in terms of household income and use those measures to see how you can distribute resources better to people and communities who need the resources better. And the DA is on reasonable ground here because, for example, if you want a NSFAS bursary as a student, you can't access the NSFAS bursary if your household income is above 350,000 Rand a year. So already we're starting to see socioeconomic measures in place to enable resources to flow to the really needy, poor communities in terms of resource access. Now, if you build a framework along those lines in terms of economic measures, socioeconomic indicators, then you might have something that's plausible, but it's got to be aligned to the statement about legacies of the past and the reality of racial inequality and racial advantage and disadvantage. To separate the two is a suggestion that the divisions in the DA haven't been reconciled on this one. They're just fighting different battles in different places in the policy document.